Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining this, our seventh session of our conference on the global governance of plastic pollution, transforming the global plastics economy. I'm really delighted you could join us and welcome you on behalf of both UNCTAD and the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center, and also our partners in this event, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Geneva Trade Platform, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, and also UNEP's Environment and Trade Hub and the Geneva Environment Network. So a big group of collaborators and our financial supporters for the Swiss Network of International Studies. So thank you all again for joining us. And I have a great pleasure to introduce Justin Wilkes as the moderator for this session. Justin is from the one and only, and therefore the leading international NGO working on standard setting internationally. Justin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and a very big welcome to everyone to this session. ECOS is the Environmental Coalition on Standards. We're an international environmental NGO with a network of members and experts advocating for environmentally friendly technical standards, policies and laws. And this session, session 7, is on international standards, private-public partnerships and voluntary initiatives. We've got a very good lineup of speakers. I'll introduce them very briefly. We have Nils HEUER from UNEP, Reinhard WEISSINGER, former ISO and DIN official. We have Ambrogio MISEROCCHI from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We have Ava Ruskeska from GRID Arendal, and Constantine Klein from the Graduate Institute. Our first speaker today is Nils, who is Associate Programme Officer at the UN Environment Programme, working on consumer information and eco-labelling. He's part of UNEP's Economy division and based in Paris, and he develops and implements projects, supports countries, facilitates stakeholder exchange and collaboration, and organises activities and events to strengthen consumer information for more sustainable consumption and production globally. He holds a master's degree in sustainable development and environmental government. Nils, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin and Caroline, for the introductions and also for the invitation to be part of this panel. Let me just go straight into my presentation because I know time is valuable. So yeah, today I want to speak to you about consumer information on plastic packaging. Of course, at UNEP, we have a lot of different initiatives and topics or work streams on tackling plastic pollution, but yeah, I will focus on consumer information today for today's session. And yeah, just to mention that in the opening. Next slide, please, or I can control it, I guess. So yeah, and on the topic of consumer information, we at UNEP, together with Consumers International, under the umbrella of the Consumer Information Program, under which we also have ECOS as a partner, so it's nice to see some familiar faces today. We developed a report last year on plastic packaging in particular, and the report is called "Can I Recycle This?" And we looked at on-package communications on plastic packaging regarding what information is shared with consumers there. And we found, yeah, in the review, we looked at labels and claims that are found on plastic packaging and the standards and certifications behind them. We had a global focus here and had collected examples from around the globe. And yeah, I'd like to share a couple of the findings that we found. And before I go into that, just to mention a little bit the assessment methodology we used for the report. So yeah, as I said, we identified the standards, labels, and claims, and then we tried to categorize them based on the functionality we found or the information they provided. And the most common captured aspects were compostability of plastic packaging, biodegradability, recyclability, recycled content, or bio-based plastics. So these are the main categories that we identified, and then we developed a comprehensive catalog of these standards, labels, and claims, and try to also analyze them in terms of the information they provide. And we used for that purpose an expert consultation process. So we involved 33 experts on consumer rights, packaging, labeling, and standards, and asked them to review and assess, in particular, the 31 labels that we identified in our mapping around communicating plastic consumer information on plastic packaging. And for the assessment, then we basically used as a methodology the guidelines for providing product sustainability information. That's a report we also published under the Consumer Information Program in 2017, together with the International Trade Center. And there we developed basically 10 different principles for the credible provisioning of consumer information or product sustainability information. And these are categorized into 5 fundamental principles and 5 aspirational principles. And the 5 fundamental principles are the ones that should be met when making claims about product sustainability. And the 5 aspirational ones are more about trying to improve even further. And when we made the assessment of the plastic packaging communications, we looked at how well they match to the 5 fundamental principles of reliability, relevance, clarity, transparency, and accessibility. And unfortunately, we found that out of the 31 labels we assessed, only about 6 of them really received generally positive evaluations from our experts. There were a lot in the neutral score range, and also quite a few in receiving mixed evaluations, showing that there's also some discrepancy in how the information is viewed and perceived even by experts. And finally, also some that had negative scores. So it showed that there was a lot of room for improvement, with only about 19% of the labels matching the 5 fundamental principles quite well. So taking all that into account, and also, I mean, I don't go into claims today in my presentation here, but I think with regards to claims, there was even more problematic examples to be found. Also, for example, we know that now there's more and more regulation against single-use plastics, and then sometimes the way around for companies is just to say that plastic packaging is reusable or material is reusable, but that's even more problematic, I guess. And I know that ECOS just recently also launched a report on that topic on plastic products and the claims that are made about them, and found similar results in terms of them not matching very well with the principles of the guidelines. So just to say on the key findings and recommendations we had in the report. So basically, we developed 5 recommendations that we would like to see followed up and implemented to improve the consumer information on plastic packaging. And first of all, the businesses and also the labeling organizations should follow the principles of the guidelines for providing product sustainability information when they make plastic packaging communications. And then we also saw that there's a huge need for better harmonization of definitions about the content and disposal of plastic packaging on a global level. Also, standards, labels, and claims need to better reflect actual conditions. I think that was particularly problematic, for example, with regards to biodegradability or compostability, where we know that these claims are now very popular in a way, but currently we don't really have the infrastructure to deal with these kind of packagings. For example, so it can only, like in many cases, it can even lead to further contamination of waste streams because these are not disposed in the right way because there's not the infrastructure available. And then the fourth point is that also the use of the chasing arrow symbol, that's something that we found to be very problematic because it's used in a lot of different contexts and should ideally only be used to indicate recyclability to not confuse consumers. I mean, a popular example, for example, is the green dot that is very commonly used in packaging in Europe and doesn't necessarily indicate recyclability of the packaging. And finally, we advocate that there's that more informative and verified recycling labels should be adopted and they're properly used and enforced. So with regards to recycling labels, we found actually that there were a couple of good examples, for example, from Australia or South Africa. So there are good examples to follow for other countries, but of course it also depends a little bit on the local infrastructure that is available. That's one of the limitations, of course. But overall, I think it's, for example, important also with regards to definitions that something should only be declared as recyclable if that also happens at practice and at scale in the specific country that the product is sold. Checking on the time, I guess I have a couple more minutes to mention that also we developed some additional materials after we launched the report last year. So we developed 3 key message papers that provide specific recommendations for action for businesses, governments, and standard setters and labeling organizations. So here we went a little bit deeper into the 3 different stakeholder groups and looked at what those specific actors can do to improve the consumer information on plastic packaging. and also gave some examples from different countries or initiatives to illustrate what can be done. And finally, we also launched 5 case studies of labels with a detailed assessment against the 5 fundamental principles of the guidelines, including, for example, the Australian recycling label and the one in South Africa, but also other initiatives like the Pent ABC logo in Denmark, or a logo for reduced plastic packaging in Singapore. And just to mention a couple of next steps. So of course, we continue the outreach and stakeholder engagement towards more credible sustainability information through the Consumer Information Program, not just on plastic packaging, but more generally, of course, on consumer information for sustainable consumption and production. And we are also planning a joint One Planet Network report on our plastics initiative that we have, under which we develop these materials on consumer information, but also other programs have different outputs to contribute. For example, the Sustainable Tourism Program has an initiative to combat plastic pollution in the tourism value chains. And our results will be presented at the next UNEA, United Nations Environment Assembly in February 2021. So that's just a quick overview of our work on this topic, and I'm happy to join the discussion later.
Nils, thank you very much. One very quick question from Tricia Farrelly. Did your assessment include transparency about toxicity?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. What was the question?
Did your assessment include transparency information about toxicity? And if so,
I guess it depends on whether the labels had the criteria on that, but yeah, overall, I think the transparency principle is more about being, of course, transparent about how you, make how the claims are generated, for example. So if you say something about toxicity, it needs to be clear how this is assessed in your labeling scheme or in the certification scheme, and that's kind of the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. We now move on to the next speaker, which is Reinhard WEISSINGER, who is a former senior expert research and education at ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. Prior to that, he worked for the German standardization body DIN. Reinhard will be speaking about the international standards landscape that he has taken a very close look at from a plastics perspective. Reinhard, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And I will give you, this is a very complex topic, and I will give you a high level kind of overview of standards organizations and what they do, and which let's say, what their work is in the field of plastics and the environment. Now, okay, so but before I start, I want briefly to go into this. I want briefly to define what is actually a standard, and it's important to understand the difference between a standard and a regulation. And standards are voluntary instruments that are developed through consensus by different stakeholders. They provide rules and guidelines, characteristics for cases where you have common and repeated, let's say, requirements or needs, and standards should be based on results of science, technology, and experience. If you look at this slide, it's probably a little bit confusing, but it also shows one of the issues we will be talking about a little bit later, that you have quite a large number of standards organizations. So this starts from national standards organization, which is one standards organization in a country. Then you have international organizations. You have standards development taking place in UN organizations. Then you have regional organizations that develop standards, in particular in Europe, but also in other countries, in other parts of the world, Africa, in Asia, and so on. And you have a specific situation in the United States, where you have a number of organizations that have that are originally US, but have a large-scale international impact on markets and technology development. Now, Now, you have on the right-hand side what I mentioned here with consortia and NGOs. You have organizations that are, so to say, have a shorter history, have are mainly driven by, let's say, NGOs, companies, and so on, and work typically in a very specific area, such as, let's say, cotton, or they work on, let's say, coffee or certain crops, or the consortia in certain areas of IT. Whereas the other organizations, which are often also referred to generally as the formal standards organization, they have a broad field and work in many areas. Now, coming to plastics, I would like to introduce three organizations in a little bit more detail, which is ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, CEN, the European Committee for Standardization, and ASTM International, which is one of those US organizations that has a global reach and global impact on markets. Now, if we look at plastics, in ISO, there's a plastic committee, which has a long history. It was founded in 1947. It has developed over 700 standards, and mainly related to basic issues like, let's say, terminology, the reliability, functionality of plastics, the behavior of plastics under certain conditions, let's say heat and so on. And it has also now, since 2017, a committee on environmental aspects, a subcommittee on environmental aspects. This is now what this committee, a subcommittee on environmental aspects, does. So it works also on basic issues like terminology, but also on biodegradability and compostability requirements for bio-based plastics, and testing methods to determine, let's say, elements of bio-based plastics, carbon footprint, and so on. Now, you have at the European level, you have also a committee on plastics, and it works very closely together with the ISO committee, where you have common standards. Around 70% of the ISO standards are also European standards. And you have inside this committee a number or two basically working groups, which deal with environmental aspects of plastics, or bio-based and degradable plastics, or carbon footprint and horizontal aspects that apply to sampling, life cycle assessment for biodegradable plastics. Now, here, this is the other committee that deals with bio-based plastics, and that defines sustainability criteria, life cycle analysis for plastics, certification, labeling, declaration, and tools. In the US, the ASTM International has also a committee on plastics, was already founded in 1937. So it's a very old committee with over close to 500 standards. And it has also established a number of groups, subcommittees that deal with recycling of plastics, degradable plastics, and it deals with biodegradability of plastics under certain conditions, defines test methods, or in the field of recycled plastics, methods to determine contaminants in plastics in order to determine whether they can actually be recycled. Now, moving out of this more, let's say, detailed level, what I believe we have to look at, and what is, I believe, very important, is to look at to have a holistic view. And here, this is a value chain, a plastics value chain, which starts from raw material generation over production, the use of plastic and plastic products, to collection, sorting, recycling, and then end-of-life management. Above all of that, and this I think is a key aspect which is sometimes not emphasized enough, is, and probably not incorporated in the development of standards enough, is design aspects that from the very beginning look into the later use, reuse, and end-of-life processing of plastics that go into standards across the value chain in order to reduce or maybe even minimize leakage. Now, in terms of recommendations, I put here, this is not all what could be said, but some recommendations for standards bodies. As a follow-on to what I just said, standards bodies should have a systemic and whole value chain approach in their development of plastic standards, looking at product and material reuse and end-of-life aspects of plastics. Now, this can be facilitated and supported by a large scale and large number of recent years published studies that look at the full value chain of plastics and plastics pollution, from the World Economic Forum, UNEP, Pew System IQ, the MacArthur Foundation, as a kind of reference where the standards fit in the overall value chain, so that it's not just a very specific technical development that is being done, but it's integrated into a higher level of functionality that is being expected from standards, which is then the basis for determining the gaps, basically needs for new standards, as well as the revision of existing standards, so that they integrate these product material reuse end-of-life aspects if they, and this is the case today, I would say, omit those aspects. Then we have seen there are a lot of organizations that develop standards, including in the plastics field, in the US, in Europe, and internationally, and so on. Now, quite a number of those standards are essentially equivalent or contain similar, let's say, requirements. And it would, in my view, be a very good idea to see whether those standards could not be, so to say, mapped against each other with identifying those with similar requirements, so that if you're in the US, you use maybe a US standard. If you're in Europe, use a European standard, but they have similar requirements, and this could be considered as standards toolboxes, where you take something out of the toolbox that provides a certain service to you. Now, we have
close now, please, Reinhard.
Okay, then a material digital passport to know what is actually inside a plastic. We talk about let's say additives, a variety reduction, and standards organizations, I have to say, do not know well enough what actually the impacts of their own standards are, and so need to gather more information about the impacts of standards. And this is now the final slide. I don't want to go into the details, but what I wanted to say with this slide is that standards are important, but standards are not sufficient. Standards need to be part of a toolbox, of a package of instruments that includes regulation, incentive systems, taxation, and so on. And in that context, standards can perform an important role, but standards on their own cannot fully address the challenges of plastics pollution. Thank you.
Reinhard, thank you. I have one very quick question to you before I hand over to Ambrogio, the next speaker. There is a dramatic lack of environmental representation within the standardization organizations. So how will ISO and other standardization bodies address the challenges of plastics if it is simply industry sat around the table writing standards for themselves without any contribution from many other stakeholders?
I would say that this is not completely correct. I mean, ECOS, for example, is a participant in some of the ISO committees. I do not know about whether in plastics, but the key, I believe, is that if you look at also how ISO presents itself towards the outside, but also other standards organizations, you see the linkage with the SDGs as a being of key importance. So let's say, what's the contribution of standards towards SDGs? And I think from this perspective, standards organizations will be increasingly forced to look into these aspects, public policy aspects, and not just, let's say, technicalities, functionality, and so on. The other thing is that we see, in particular also in Europe, the legislation upcoming, let's say with the taxonomy, for example, and or also the stricter requirements on reporting, sustainability reporting. I believe all of that is a driver towards that. But I believe also that without, let's say, a really rethink through the standards organizations of what their mandate is in this world, in the let's say, these challenges we are confronted with, I think we also need some initiatives from within the standards organizations and not just from, let's say, regulators and so on. And this is a plea which I would like to formulate. Thanks.
Reinhard, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ambrogio MISEROCCHI. He's a senior analyst at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. He works as a senior analyst in their New Plastics Economy innovation team, and he's been working on the Foundation's publication calling for extended producer responsibility as a necessary part of the solution to the transition to a circular economy. He's now supporting the policy work of the Foundation, looking for gaps and actions needed to amplify the current efforts and level the playing field to deliver industry scale change to end plastic waste and pollution.
Thank you very much, Justin. It was a perfect introduction. Thank you very much. So just let me spend a few words on the New Plastics Initiative itself, because basically it's an initiative that was born around 5-6 years ago. And the goal was really to have this vision of the transition to a circular economy for plastics. Now there are more than 1,000 organizations behind it, so aligned to the vision, but there are also several tools and other initiatives, sub-initiatives within the New Plastics Economy that are basically showing what a potential path forward to achieving this circular economy could look like. And one of those is actually the Global Commitment, which is an initiative that was started back in 2018 together with the United Nations Environmental Programme. And now there are more than 500 signatories reporting to the Global Commitment every year. And the business signatories to this initiative basically represent around 20% of the plastic packaging placed on the market. Now, I do have a few slides to share, so let me just share my screen with you, because I wanted to show you some data from and learnings, actually. So, okay, so you should see the slides. This is the holding slide with my email, if you want. But I want to talk about the Global Commitment today. And as I said, it was started back in 2018. And the Global Commitment was set as a tool to achieve the vision. And basically there are 4 core elements that underpin the Global Commitment that basically lays out the way and try to make it as successful as possible in this process toward the targets that we have by 2025. And the 4 core elements are very simple. And I think that they bring somehow what was missing before in understanding the plastic packaging world. And the first element is basically common definition. So the Global Commitment brings common definitions to all the actors that are aligned behind the vision of the New Plastics Economy. It brings targets, so common targets, so that all the organizations, again, are working towards the same targets, toward the same achievement. And at the moment, we have targets for 2025. That doesn't mean that we will have a full transition to a circular economy by 2025, but that we kind of know where we are heading to, what is the direction, and then what are we learning from. Then there is a third element that I believe is very much important, and is the annual reporting. So the Global Commitment is now at the 3rd year. So we have 2 reports that were published, one in 2019 and on 2020, on the data of the previous year, basically. And this is important because for the first time, it's publicly available. What the companies are reporting, what the governments are reporting is all online. So we do have an understanding, not just on the pollution side of things, so of the after-use life of the plastic packaging, but we do know also what's going on the market, how it is treated, for what product, and so on. And then there is the last element, which I believe is extremely important, which is the raising the bar mechanism. And the raising the bar allows the Global Commitment to improve and set a different ambition level throughout the years. So as soon as we learn something, as soon as we understand what the problem is, we can modify. And this is a very important mechanism within the tool itself. Now, I want to show you this slide because these are the main signatories to the Global Commitment. And as I said, the signatories represent 20% of the plastic packaging market. And we see that basically most of the data comes from packaging companies, packaging producers, retailers, some from the downstream part of it, collection, sorting, and recycling companies, and then we also have governments. We do have some other organizations represented, slightly fewer, but from this slide, I want to draw the main learning from our experience is that we do have visibility on the entire packaging value chain. So we know what's happening along the value chain and the supply chains and the interaction and what the packaging looks like. However, we do reach 20%. And any additional change would be somehow marginal. And if we want to achieve 100%, the first learning from this experience is that voluntary commitment are basically not enough to achieve the 100% of coverage. And going more into the data, with this slide, I brought to you two main metrics because from our reports, we see some solid and encouraging progress, but we also see some areas where we definitely need more progress, and more progress is needed quickly. And on the good side of things, we saw an increase in recycled content. For instance, year to year, we saw an increase of 22% from the 5.1 to the 6.2, heading to the 25% by 2025. So this somehow is a strong increase in itself, plus 22%. And then we also see improvements for what concerns the elimination of what is commonly understood as a problematic plastic, like, for example, PVC, PVDC, black carbon, and undetectable black plastics. But then looking at what is needed, what is still needed, the learnings basically show us that there is a plateau for a reusable business model. There are pilots, there is momentum, but still we are at 2% of reusable business models against the 98% of single-use models. And this means that we do not see a strong shift from traditional delivery models to innovative delivery models. And this is true when we look at these numbers. Now, other areas of improvements that could lead to this problem is that it's not enough to innovate in packaging. We do need to innovate in products as well as business model if we want to eliminate the packaging overall. So we don't have to address the packaging itself, but we need to address everything at the same time. Then there is another point that I wanted to make is that basically when we look at recyclability, and we discussed about recyclability before, what does it mean recyclability? Is just a theoretical exercise, or is it also reflected in practice? And our definition is it goes that a packaging can be considered recyclable if it is recycled in practice and scale, without going into the details. But if we look at our signatories, we see that 65% of the packaging is recyclable. And this is driven by PET. But when we look at the global picture, this number basically goes down quickly. And globally, the figure is 29% of packaging, plastic packaging is recyclable today, according to our definition, mainly driven by flexible. And this means that it's not enough to look at changing in design of packaging if we do not have infrastructure, if we don't have a system that is able to manage all of this at the same time. Now, I want to jump to the conclusion. So the learnings, really the learnings from our progress reports. And I go back to the call to action that we published back in 2020 with our Global Commitment Progress Report. And there were two calls on businesses, and then there were two calls on governments. And the one for businesses were really to work on their packaging types and set ambitious reduction targets. While when I look at governments, basically the two call to action were to establish EPR system, extended producer responsibility policies, as well as working toward a new global agreement, international framework, policy framework for action to transition to a circular economy. And this is why we published the EPR paper that you mentioned a few months ago, calling for EPR as a necessary part of the solution, but not the only solution. And then this morning, so it's very recent, this morning, we published a white paper for a new UN treaty to address plastic waste and pollution. And this is because basically, if I have to summarize the learnings from our experience, voluntary commitments are not enough in itself. They're very useful to make us understand where we are, what's the situation, what the picture looks like, but we need to go one step forward. And so I want to conclude on this, that basically we are now here today because there's the ministerial conference going on in a few days. We are calling for a global policy instrument to address plastic waste and pollution. And I think that this is very important to acknowledge that this is the learning from our experience and probably the best way moving forward, bringing everyone together, bringing definitions together, revising, as Reinhard said, the standards, and making one step forward because we need change and we need to make it happen quite fast. So that's it for me, Justin.
Thank you very much, Ambrogio. You mentioned your white paper that you've launched this morning. It looks like a good paper, but you didn't go into details of what a treaty should be looking like or detailing. What was the reasoning for that?
Yes, so I'm glad that you read the paper, at least the highlight of the paper, because we thought, and this is quite typical from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we need to bring alignment. We need to bring everyone on the same page when it comes to this topic and when it comes to the transition to the circular economy and addressing the plastic pollution crisis. Now, in our paper, we basically lay out what's the rationale for a new UN treaty, a legally binding agreement, a global agreement, if we really want to address the issue, because like ad hoc solutions are proven not to be enough. Single solution across the different geographies are not communicated to each other. Voluntary agreement are not really, are delivering on their targets, but we need to do more. And so really the foundation mission was to create a circular economy. And we believe that the next step is really to adopt this new treaty for plastic waste and pollution. I hope I didn't answer your question, sorry.
And yeah, I think a very interesting point that voluntary initiatives, private-public partnerships are not going to be doing it alone. Our next speaker is Ava Ruskeska, who's a senior environmental expert with a background in chemistry, and she works for Grid Arendal, a Norwegian non-profit environmental communication centre. Her work focuses on the science policy nexus around pollution, especially plastic pollution, and she advocates for policy change in the plastic waste trade, including broadening of the scope to encompass plastic production and consumption. She collaborates closely with the Basel Convention and is active in international forums such as the Plastic Waste Partnership, and she's participated in the development of several technical guidelines under the Basel Convention. Ava, the floor is yours.
So thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. I think I have been, I'm not only a speaker, but I also participant, and I open my ears and eyes to see what other colleagues are doing and really profit from this very vast majority of knowledge. So I will be speaking about inventory of global and regional plastic waste initiatives. And it very nicely builds up on previous speakers. Our knowledge about plastic pollution is increasing. We know more about microplastics, their impacts. So following this trend, the number of initiatives also increases. But can we solve the plastic crisis with those immediate responses? There is a common view that plastic crises are embedded in weak waste management practices, and particularly developing economies should be a focus of the action. While some of these things are correct, others are closer of being a myth rather than a truth. Speaking about the plastic waste at the global level, the first entrance point is the Basel Convention, being the only globally binding multilateral environmental agreement that covers waste management issues. And we already heard about the convention and its role in previous sessions. The Plastic Waste Partnership, established by the Conference of the Parties under the Convention in 2019, got a task to map out existing initiatives on plastic waste and see where the activities are lagging and where cooperation is possible. Grid Arendal invested some time to look into plastic waste initiatives, and this report that I'm talking about now is a summary of that work. This work has been carried out last year, so I believe that there are some updates, but the conclusions remains the same. So where is the... We have examined a sample of 60 global and 37 regional voluntary initiatives. Each of the initiatives was closely looked at by analyzing who is the lead and partner organization, what initiative is covering and offering, when they have started, why and where they are operating. The majority of global initiatives were established recently, actually, with only 18 initiatives before 2015. This well correlates with increased knowledge and also the global discussion facilitated by UNEP. The analysis also included accountability and reporting mechanisms, as many initiatives table concrete commitments, as we heard from the previous speaker. The global initiatives, which operate in multiple countries, are often led by intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations and focus on strengthening waste operational capacities, awareness raising, and education. Very similar picture appears analyzing regional initiatives. So what are the findings, the main findings of that report? There is fragmented thematical coverage. Most initiatives focuses on the consequences rather than the source of the problem. Those are being waste management and consumer participation through cleanups, awareness raising, and communication. The initiatives skip the source of the problem, which is plastic production and consumption in more holistic way. And it's quite understandable. And this conference also underlines exactly the same findings. Even about half of the initiatives have concrete targets. The initiatives suffer from weak accountability and reporting. So the traceability, how they are doing, often lags behind. The geographical coverage of the initiatives is far from comprehensive. Most of the initiatives takes place in Europe, some in Asia, but very few initiatives are taking place in Africa and Latin America. And what are the main recommendations? Plastic waste initiatives should broaden their scope by considering the entire life cycle of plastics, starting from production and design of products, going through the life cycle until the end of the product use. Steps should be taken to develop a legally binding international framework that overcomes the current accountability and monitoring challenges in combating the plastic pollution crisis. And measures should be taken to secure equal engagement within as many states as possible to fill in the large existing geographical gap. So I invite everybody to take a look at the report. It is available online, and we hope that this serves as a tool and also help to many states and decision makers, especially when we start talking about the global agreement on plastics. Thank you.
Ava, thank you very much indeed. I'll move straight on to the final speaker, who is Constantine Klein. Constantine Klein is currently working on a PhD in international law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And he's also wrapping things up as a research assistant for a project on regulating plastic production and pollution under the umbrella of the Global Governance Center. So, Konstantin, your time starts now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I have to make a short announcement in the beginning. Is somehow the title of my presentation in the program got a bit mixed up. I'm talking today about global governance approaches to reduce plastic production and pollution. I think that might be because I broke my leg a few weeks ago in the run-up to this conference, and I would like to apologize for that. I'm coming from a legal background, and coming from the legal field to the issue of plastic pollution and production. At the moment, the current hot topic is clearly a legally binding agreement, a multilateral treaty. We have seen that also yesterday with the first panel of this conference, which was addressing this issue. Most of these efforts are aimed at solving the marine plastic pollution issue, as much of the public support for such a treaty has crystallized around images of marine pollution, such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So writing another paper about the plastic treaty would be akin to carrying oaths to Athens. So in my research at the Global Governance Center, I have focused on different approaches from the field of global governance we could use to reduce the production of plastic and plastic pre-products. This stays in line with the general approach we have taken in the project to address plastics not only as waste, but throughout the whole life cycle, as the environmental impacts at every stage of the life cycle, from starting with the raw material extraction to the disposal, must be addressed and minimized. Further, also the pollution issue that sparked the public debate is better solved by a life cycle approach. Every piece of plastic that is not produced in the first place, we don't have to recycle or dispose of, and doesn't have the potential to become waste. I'm not intending to suggest in my presentation that a multilateral environmental treaty would be completely superfluous, but I would like to propose some complementary approaches which could be used in addition to developing such a treaty. These might be faster to implement, or in some areas go further than a plastic treaty. Nevertheless, I would like to mention at this point that many of the efforts for a plastic treaty are really focusing on solving the plastic waste problem, answering to the public support mentioned before, but this framing is potentially neglecting the whole life cycle of plastics. Further, since the early 1990s, the track record to actually get a significant number of ratifications for a multilateral environmental treaty hasn't been very good. Some successes have been made in the field of very specialized agreements with a very specific focus, but the wider the scope of an agreement has been, the less likely it seems that it can be extensively ratified within a short time frame. The first approach I would like to talk about, keeping the time in mind, is approaches to extend jurisdiction. This is a development coming from fields as international criminal law or corporate responsibilities, and means essentially that states are enforcing their domestic norms outside their territory by extending their jurisdiction. This allows for an enforcement of norms where the state who would have the primary jurisdiction, meaning mostly the territorial state, is unwilling or unable to perform this enforcement. This approach would be fruitful for the plastic issue if we can attain a significant number of states with a rather powerful judicial system, meaning the European Union states, the US, to implement such extraterritorial applicable norms relating to plastic production. There's two recent developments which are notable here. The first, several countries in the EU, France, Switzerland, with something called Konzernverantwortungsinitiative, and Germany with a Lieferkettengesetz, meaning essentially like a delivery chain law, have introduced legislations in the last 18 months addressing human rights and environmental concerns through the whole life cycle of products. Irrespective of where the geographical loci of the production, importers and vendors must ensure that specific minimum standards with regard to human rights and environmental standards are met. It is well conceivable that such specific standards regarding the use of plastics in production and packaging or reusability of plastic products could be included in such laws. Very interestingly, at the moment, the European Union is drafting mandatory due diligence legislations with a similar aim of forcing companies to obey minimum standards throughout the product lifecycle, irrespective of where this production takes place. It should be mentioned, though, that as of now, it's rather unclear how such legislation is compatible with the like product concept under the WTO rules, but I'm afraid I'm lacking the time to really address this question in this presentation. Second, very short, briefly, also the idea to include environmental crimes in the category of international crimes, which allow for universal jurisdiction, is gaining traction. There's a new concept of ecocide around, but it remains seen whether we can really use this in the plastics context, probably most likely in some practice of large-scale disposal of plastic waste in developing countries. Second, briefly, I would like to address how non-binding agreements, such as national commitments, like the pledges under the Paris Agreement on climate change, could be instrumentalized. The general idea is to use transparency and publicity on such non-binding pledges to bring those actors who have made these pledges to a point where they cannot back down from this acceptance. Even if they might have entered such a pledge mostly as a lip service, kind of in a hypothetical statement, they can get to a point through public pressure where they cannot back down anymore. And further, several countries have recently found out that, very surprisingly to them, their national courts might enforce such non-binding pledges or collective obligations like the 1.5-degree goal from the Paris Agreement against them in national courts. This has happened both with the Paris Agreement in the HEUER case in the UK last year, and this year also with the Paris Agreement in the German Constitutional Court. This might also be of interest for those who are concentrating on constructing a plastic treaty. I hope that I have about 2 more minutes, and would like to briefly mention hybrid regimes. A useful example for this in this context is the Kimberley process certification scheme for conflict diamonds, which uses a labeling or certification scheme, but differently to most that have been addressed before, like the ones addressed by Nils, is that if a state signs up to this Kimberley process, they're barred from trading or allowing trade with diamonds with non-participating states. So meaning essentially once you're in this process, you can only trade with other states who are also in this process and a certification scheme, which provides a rather strong incentive. And finally, before I'm running out of time, I'm also addressing in my paper I'm presenting here, labeling and certifications, even though there's already more work being done on this by others in the research project. But I would like to submit here that as private standards and labels, depending a lot on peer pressure, consumer pressure, naming and shaming to be actually effective, this requires a large amount of exposure of the actors to a critical public. And I'm not sure whether such a public exists for the actors in the especially upstream parts of the plastic production, the raw material extraction, the whole supply chain. And so as these products often don't reach the end customer, they might be hidden inside somewhere in a computer, in packaging, only used in the production. And so it seems doubtful whether labeling systems can have such a large impact on the reduction of plastic production in general. I hope that I didn't run too much over time, Justin. And
Konstantin,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I want to run now from your last point into a discussion between the panelists. And I also want to take that opportunity to throw in the question that came right at the beginning from Stella Whitman. My question to the panelists, and I think particularly Nils from UNEP, we've heard a lot of focus on consumers, putting the burden on consumers through using eco labels, using the provision of environmental information on product labels, regardless of the quality of that information. Is that what is going to drive change? Are consumers in the lead here? So is it going to be voluntary consumer actions? Is it going to be voluntary industry initiatives through standardization? Or is it going to be binding regulation from governments? And I'm thinking microplastics, I'm thinking washing machines. How are we going to ensure that washing machines develop filters to prevent microplastic pollution? Is that best going to come, Nils, from consumer information from industry, or from, for example, a binding regulation under the European Union's eco-design regulation?
Yeah, thank you, Justin, for the question. I think it's not really helpful to focus too much on the role of consumers right now, because I think there is a much more that needs to be done from businesses and governments to set up a better infrastructure, and also think better of how to design and use plastic and in products and so on. Because right now, I mean, even as a aware consumer, there's very little you can do, I guess. I mean, of course, you can try to avoid plastic in products as best as you can, and we know the popular examples of the straw or the plastic bag, but this is not going to make a big difference in the overall picture. And we know that right now the predictions are even that plastic production will increase further. And even if we make progress on the recycling side, as others have said, we really need to tackle this problem much more upstream in a way, and move towards a more circular economy of plastic. And I think there the responsibility is with governments and businesses.
Therefore, building on that and looking at global regulatory architecture, whether that's an international treaty, whether that's regional cooperation, how do the panelists, particularly Reinhard and Ambrogio, how do you feel that such legislation can provide the ambition, can provide direction of travel? Has, for example, Ava, the Basel Convention been successful in doing that? What do we need at the top to drive that ambition? Because I suspect that ambition is not going to come voluntarily from industry to a sufficient level. So Reinhard, Ambrogio, and Ava, if you could react to that.
Okay, then I start. I think, and this was the conclusion of previous also discussions, is that what we need is an effort from all sides. Okay, this means consumers, but consumers are just a part of it. It needs governments, and it also means business. This morning, I listened to a presentation by Johan Rockström, yes, and he was the head of the Potsdam Institute for the Environment, and also one of the developers of the planetary boundary concepts. And he was saying that today, in today's world, we are facing for the very first time a global crisis where the whole global system, the Earth system, may collapse and may go in a direction which makes life no longer livable. And listening to all these technicalities, and we need to do this and that, we need a fundamental change in orientation that has to come from business, that has to come from governments, that has to come from consumers. And standards, for example, what I represented here is just an element in this, but all a fundamental shift in mindset. That's what we need.
Reinhard, thank you.
And not only one particular, let's say, component, but
Reinhard,
definitely,
we need to come to a conclusion.
Sorry.
Ambrogio, Ava, please.
I fully agree with the system change that we need. So a shift in mindset to have the complete picture of the things. I want to go back to your point on the Basel Convention, and I think it's a good example where basically the parties agreed on a mandatory agreement at international scale, and showed that it's kind of possible. Of course, it is extremely hard, as Konstantin laid out, to establish a global treaty on plastic pollution, marine litter is extremely difficult. But basically, going back to the point that I made before, The voluntary initiative showed that it's possible. So there is a potential solution, but we need to make one step further. And potentially the global agreement would aggregate, sorry, I stopped, would have the potential to aggregate all of this.
Last word to Ava, very, very briefly. You've got 10 seconds.
Thank you very much. What I mentioned already in my presentation, what is important that we account and monitor our progress. With voluntary initiatives, we have not managed to do so. Even everybody is coming forward with their activities and proposals and do something very, very concrete. It's not enough to measure the progress. So I think that this is what treaty is going to propose. We mentioned the Basel Convention, and yes, of course, it also measures action, and parties need to report to the Secretariat about transboundary movements. But it's only small slice of the story. So as we already mentioned several times, the challenge here and also opportunity, of course, to look at the life cycle of plastics.
Ava, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this session. I've been cheeky and I've highlighted ECOS's publication on the role that voluntary initiative standards can play in support of a global treaty. I would like to highlight everyone to fill in and complete the feedback form that will be available on this session. So please do that. And I'll hand back to Caroline and say thank you very much for attending this afternoon session. And thank you in particular to the speakers.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Justin. And thanks also for posting that link to a really interesting paper, and also Ambrogio for your new paper as well. Great presentations. I just wanted to thank you all again and invite you all back 15 minutes for the final session of this conference. So thank you all again and look forward to seeing you soon.